Initiating development, this knight targets central influence, subtly preparing for an aggressive queenside buildup. Seizing central space immediately, black establishes an imposing pawn presence, ready to contest control. Building the fianchetto aims for kingside dominion, preparing kingside castling and eyeing the long diagonal. Developing knights symmetrically offers solid central influence, preparing for a flexible pawn structure. The bishop now eyes the long diagonal, creating a potential outpost and preparing for kingside development. Opening a diagonal for the queen and solidifying central control, black prepares to fianchetto the bishop or develop knights. Securing the king's safety, now, allows white to focus on developing the remaining pieces for a cohesive central presence. Centering the bishop establishes a solid defensive structure, preparing to castle and contest the d5 pawn. Challenging the center's pawn structure, this c4 thrust opens lines and seeks to disrupt black's solid development. Securing the king's safety immediately, black prioritizes a solid defensive structure, aligning with white's own developing strategy. Orchestrating queenside pressure, the monarch's defender swiftly eyes the central diagonal, preparing to support a potential pawn thrust or facilitate piece redistribution as white seeks to exploit the slightly cramped nature of black's kingside pawn structure, aiming to create long-term positional advantages by controlling key squares and challenging black's central establishment. Boldly staking territory in the center, black challenges white's pawn chain and immediately restricts the mobility of white's light-squared bishop, creating a central pawn island that will require careful management. Reinforcing the central pawn chain after black's aggressive d4 push now offers a solid pawn structure, preparing for a potential kingside expansion or a central break later. Solidifying central influence, black erects a robust pawn chain, a clear signal of intent to contest the d4 square and potentially prepare for a queenside expansion. This steadfast posture denies white immediate central breakthroughs and subtly prepares for a potential pawn storm. Solidifying the center and preparing development, this move also anchors the d3 pawn, preventing black from immediately pushing further and potentially creating an isolated pawn later. Developing the knight to a central square like c6, as black does here, is a standard and sensible idea, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for further queenside expansion, while also putting immediate pressure on white's central control and hinting at a potential pawn break with b5 down the line. Opening that central diagonal for your bishop, 9. X4 liberates the d-pawn and aims to dismantle black's pawn chain, a crucial turning point as the board starts to breathe. The pawn chain now solidifies, creating a robust central pawn structure for black that challenges white's queenside space and offers a safe haven for the king. Securing the queenside expansion with this pawn advance denies black immediate counterplay on that flank and prepares to develop the queen's bishop to a more active square, potentially aiming for b2. Opening up the queenside for potential infiltration or creating a pawn chain barrier against white's queenside expansion are the primary considerations here, a bold statement of intent to contest central space. The bishop now ventures out, seeking to disrupt black's established pawn structure by pinning the knight. This creates immediate tactical possibilities and forces black to consider defensive measures, potentially sacrificing material or compromising pawn placement to break the pin. Asserting central presence, black immediately challenges white's pawn structure, aiming to pry open lines for future counterplay and prevent white from establishing an impenetrable pawn fortress. Reinforcing the central pawn chain and preparing for a potential kingside advance, this maneuver also opens the e-file for the rook, anticipating future skirmishes. A proactive realignment for the queen, addressing the cramped queenside and eyeing a potential pawn push on the d-file to disrupt white's central buildup. NBD2 orchestrates a subtle realignment, aiming to reinforce the center and prepare for a potential kingside assault, while simultaneously enhancing the knight's defensive capabilities against black's central grip. Intending to dislodge the bishop, this pawn push subtly questions white's piece placement and aims to gain breathing room on the kingside, potentially preparing for a later, G5 advanced to challenge white's queenside expansion. Exchanging the bishop on f6 fundamentally reshapes black's pawn structure, creating doubled pawns that will forever be a target and diminishing the influence of the fianchettoed bishop. This frees up the e-file for white's rook, potentially opening lines towards the black king. Now, white's pieces can maneuver more freely, aiming for central control and a kingside attack, while black must meticulously defend against the structural weaknesses and potential mating threats. Regaining the bishop solidifies black's central pawn structure, creating a compact and resilient defensive pawn chain that hinders white's knight development and limits the reach of their queenside pieces, while simultaneously preparing to contest the d-file with the rooks. Pushing the c-pawn here aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses on the queenside and seizing more space for white's pieces. Preparing for an eventual queenside expansion or consolidating central control, black repositions the bishop to a more passive square, effectively relinquishing the strong diagonal it occupied. Unleashing the knight to a dynamic outpost on c4, white immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and aims to exploit the open diagonal for the light-squared bishop. Black recaptures, consolidating their pawn structure after the exchange, but this creates a slightly passive bishop on c5, now directly eyed by white's knight on c4. While the immediate material is equalized, the trade of bishops has simplified the position, and white's knight on c4, supported by the queen on c2, exerts pressure on the queenside, potentially eyeing b6 or a5 in the future. Black needs to be mindful of developing counterplay and finding active squares for their pieces, as the current pawn setup might lead to a cramped position if white can maintain central control. Dislodging the knight from its robust central post opens a fascinating tactical labyrinth, potentially unraveling black's pawn structure for future exploitation by the queen and rooks. Capturing the knight on e5 initiates a crucial exchange, aiming to simplify the position and relieve some of the pressure black has been experiencing on the queenside. By removing white's attacking knight, black seeks to solidify their pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay, although the doubled pawns on the d-file present a long-term structural challenge that must be carefully managed. The knight's return to e5 ignites a tactical skirmish, opening up lines of attack and potentially forcing a simplification that could favor white's piece activity, given black's slightly backward pawn on d4. Bringing the bishop back to guard the pawn feels like a cautious regrouping, aiming to solidify the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential exchanges, although it surrenders the initiative a bit by not challenging the knight directly and allowing white to maintain a pawn majority on the kingside. Asserting dominion over the open c-file, white's rook now occupies a position of considerable influence, prepared to support advances and control critical squares, while black's queen, though actively placed, finds itself indirectly pressured by this newly established central authority. Bringing the rook to the open c-file sharpens black's pressure, creating immediate demands on white's queen and potentially preparing to contest the central pawn structure that has become rather locked. Unlocking the queenside with b4 immediately pressures black's advanced pawn chain and seeks to exploit the newfound space for white pieces, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious development by forcing concessions on the queenside and potentially creating dynamic imbalances. Capturing the pawn is a double-edged sword, sacrificing immediate central control for the potential of a tactical skirmish, though it allows white to solidify their queenside presence and potentially exploit the open c-file. Seizing control of the open file, this maneuver aggressively challenges black's pawn structure, forcing a decision and potentially creating weaknesses for the opponent's queenside. Reclaiming the sacrificed pawn injects immediate material equality, but does this recapture address the lingering weakness on the queenside, or does it invite further structural complications for black? Unlocking the d-file with that capture dramatically alters the board's geometry, creating immediate pressure and a clear target on black's queen. Black consolidates after the tactical exchange, aiming to re-establish a solid pawn structure and eliminate the immediate pressure on the queenside. The capture on c7 decisively resolves the central tension and sets up an endgame where white's knight boasts superior mobility compared to black's isolated pawns. Black seizes the opportunity to simplify into a potentially advantageous pawn structure with this exchange, aiming to exploit the open files and pressure white's weakened kingside after the recent exchanges. Prying loose that isolated pawn leaves black's king exposed on the queenside, creating a juicy target for your remaining heavy pieces. The rook swings into action, aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonal and potentially harass the exposed white king, turning a seemingly quiet endgame into a dynamic battle for initiative. Unleashing a knight to g5, a daring dive into enemy territory, white aims to exploit the awkward placement of black's rook on a2, potentially forcing it to retreat and sacrificing material for positional advantage. The black king, suddenly exposed, faces immediate and severe threats as the bishop swoops in to deliver a check, forcing the white king into a precarious position and initiating a decisive phase of the game. The monarch is being exposed to immediate peril. A hasty relocation to a more sheltered square is imperative to dodge the coming storm of the opposing bishop and knight. Grasping the initiative, black reclaims material and offers a pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's already precarious material advantage, aiming to activate their pieces against an exposed monarch. Seizing the open file, the rook aims to disrupt black's consolidating pieces. A bold assertion of central influence, challenging the bishop's role in this newly simplified arrangement. This rook's relocation fundamentally alters the dynamic, threatening to exploit the weakened king's position. White sacrifices material for a powerful positional advantage, seeking to dominate the 7th rank. The move capitalizes on black's misplaced pieces, aiming to create immediate attacking opportunities. By occupying the 7th rank, white exerts immense pressure and restricts black's defensive options. This rook's repositioning is a strategic gamble, forcing black to react defensively. A decisive rook maneuver that aims to dismantle black's pawn structure and launch a final assault. The king's vulnerability is paramount as the rook sweeps in, seeking to expose the monarch and gain immediate attacking momentum. The monarch's sanctuary is now compromised, exposing the king to the gnawing threats of the rook still lurking on the 1st rank, necessitating immediate defensive repositioning rather than material gain. The black king, having completed its strategic journey from the center, now embarks on a perilous expedition across a fractured battlefield, seeking refuge from the lurking danger presented by the lone rook on the 7th rank. Focusing the monarch towards the center is a pragmatic choice, aiming to activate it in the ensuing pawn-heavy endgame where active kings often dictate the tempo. The rook now swings over to the 1st rank, aiming to disrupt white's king further and potentially support a pawn advance or create counterplay on the queenside if white isn't careful with the remaining material. Unleashing the bishop to patrol the longest diagonal, this move aims to exploit the king's exposed position, potentially creating a powerful attacking battery with the rook. Bringing the king into the fray promises more dynamic play than passively guarding the pawn. A bold injection of activity, this pawn push aims to disrupt the enemy's entrenched defense and potentially create weaknesses around the black king by opening up new lines of attack. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, black immediately creates a dynamic imbalance and aims to exploit the now exposed white monarch, seeking to generate counterplay where none seemed apparent. Exposing the black king further, this capture exploits the open file and forces a critical decision regarding king's safety. The king emerges from its protective shell, embracing a challenging central role in this simplified endgame where pawn structure dictates the dynamic. The monarch ventures forth, seeking an escape route from the looming pawn assault. Activating the rook and centralizing it on the 3rd rank puts immediate pressure on white's king and seeks to exploit the potential weakness created by the pawn push.